The armory smelled of gun, oil, and history, a scent that transported Staff Sergeant Maya Chen back through decades of military tradition. She moved methodically between rows of gleaming rifles, her weathered hands running across polished metal and synthetic stocks. Each weapon represented the military's obsession with advancement, with technology, with the latest innovations that promised dominance on modern battlefields. But Maya's fingers stopped at one particular corner, where dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight filtering through the high windows. There it stood, an M1 Garand rifle from World War II, its wooden stock scarred and darkened by 70 years of existence. The metal showed patina from countless campaigns, from distant lands where this very weapon had determined the fate of nations. Maya lifted it carefully, as if handling something sacred. The weight felt familiar in her hands, balanced perfectly between her palms like a meditation object. She ran her thumb across the engraved serial number, wondering whose hands had gripped this rifle before hers, whose eyes had looked down its iron sights, whose finger had squeezed its trigger in moments of desperation and glory. General Marcus Bradford burst through the armory doors with the confidence of a man accustomed to immediate deference. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete floor in a rhythm that announced authority. Behind him trailed 7 officers in dress uniforms, their expressions carefully neutral but their eyes sharp, observing everything. Bradford was on an inspection tour, a routine visit designed to demonstrate his command's modernization efforts, to showcase the cutting-edge equipment that supposedly made American soldiers invincible. He expected to see arrays of AR-15s configured with advanced optics, sniper rifles equipped with thermal imaging and ballistic computers, weapons systems that looked like they'd materialized from science fiction. Instead, he found Maya standing in a corner like an archaeologist, cradling what appeared to be a museum piece. Bradford's laugh erupted loudly, bouncing off the armory walls like a weapon discharge. "That," he bellowed, his voice laden with amusement and barely concealed contempt. The officers behind him erupted in synchronized chuckles, the dutiful laughter of subordinates confirming their commander's superiority. One younger officer even shook his head, as if witnessing incompetence firsthand. Maya didn't flinch. Her expression remained perfectly composed, her dark eyes displaying no irritation, no defensiveness, no reaction to the mockery. Instead, she looked at the general with an intensity that somehow managed to be respectful and utterly immovable simultaneously. She raised the M1 Garand slowly, cradling it like a mother holds an infant, and turned to face Bradford directly. "This rifle," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the armory's ambient silence like a blade through water, "has killed from distances that modern soldiers can't even imagine." The words emerged without anger or defensiveness, simply as factual statements about reality. In the hands of a properly trained marksman, this antique has proven more lethal than most contemporary weapons systems in controlled environments. Bradford's laughter died mid-breath. The officers exchanged confused glances. Something in Maya's voice, a combination of absolute certainty mixed with dangerous confidence, made the temperature in the armory seem to drop several degrees. Her eyes locked onto his without flinching, without backing down, displaying an unfamiliar kind of authority that had nothing to do with rank. Bradford had built his career on conventional thinking, on impressive performance metrics and modern equipment procurement budgets that pleased his superiors. But he possessed enough instinct to recognize when someone possessed genuine knowledge he lacked. Maya's certainty unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Show me," he challenged, the words emerging more as a demand than a request. His tone suggested skepticism, mockery, the tone of a man certain he'd never see this sergeant again after whatever foolishness was about to unfold. The officers behind him straightened, ready to witness a demonstration that would confirm their commander's superiority and this sergeant's delusion. Maya lowered the rifle, cradling it against her chest. A small smile played across her lips, not arrogant, not mocking, but knowing. The smile of someone who recognized opportunity when it arrived, who understood that sometimes challenges came wrapped in ridicule and dismissal. "When would you like to see it, sir?" she asked respectfully, though her eyes suggested she was already calculating trajectories and wind patterns, already running equations through her mind. Bradford turned to leave, tossing his final words over his shoulder without breaking stride. "Whenever you're ready, Sergeant. Impress me." The armory doors swung shut behind his entourage, leaving Maya alone once more with the ancient rifle and the dawning realization that she'd been given either an extraordinary opportunity or a one-way ticket to the end of her military career. She looked down at the M1 Garand in her hands, its weight suddenly feeling like destiny. 3 weeks transformed into a blur of relentless activity. Maya assembled her training regiment with surgical precision, selecting 15 recruits from the hundreds available, soldiers who possessed not necessarily the highest scores on conventional marksmanship tests, but rather those who demonstrated mental discipline, adaptability, and the capacity to think rather than simply execute orders mechanically. She separated them from standard training protocols, relocating them to a remote section of the base where old wooden structures housed her unconventional methodology. Her first lecture shattered their expectations. No PowerPoint presentations, no standardized military doctrine. Instead, Maya stood before them holding nothing but the ancient M1 Garand and a weathered notebook filled with decades of handwritten calculations. "Forget everything the Army taught you about shooting," she announced bluntly. "Weapons don't kill targets, understanding kills targets, physics kills targets, wind and gravity and temperature gradients kill targets. You're not shooters, you're physicists with rifles." The recruits exchanged bewildered glances. One brave soldier raised his hand. "Sergeant, shouldn't we focus on our equipment and sight pictures?" Maya smiled coldly. "Equipment is a crutch. Sight pictures are training wheels. I'm teaching you to shoot without either if necessary." For the next 3 weeks, she subjected them to torture disguised as education. Mathematical equations covered every whiteboard. She taught ballistic trajectory calculations that made advanced physics look simple. Wind speed analysis became meditation. Distance estimation transformed into obsession. Her recruits learned to read the environment like ancient seers read entrails, every detail containing hidden messages about projectile paths and impact points. She made them fire thousands of rounds at varying distances. Each shot required mathematical justification before pulling the trigger. Miss, and they had to write detailed explanations analyzing exactly where their calculations failed. The mental intensity exceeded physical exhaustion. 3 soldiers quit within the first week, unable to handle the psychological demands. But the remaining 12 transformed into something extraordinary. By week 3, accuracy metrics that seemed impossible became routine. 78% hit rate at extreme distances, distances where conventional military training expected 40% success rates at best. General Bradford received the performance reports in his office while reviewing quarterly budget allocations. His hands trembled slightly as he read the numbers, then reread them, convinced the reports contained typographical errors. He summoned Maya without ceremony, his administrative assistant delivering the message with nervous formality that suggested the general's mood had darkened considerably. Bradford's office occupied the command building's top floor, all glass and chrome and deliberately intimidating design. When Maya entered, she found him standing with his back to her, silhouetted against windows overlooking the entire base. He remained motionless for an uncomfortably long moment before turning. "You're dangerous," he said without preamble, his voice carrying undertones of something between admiration and threat. His uniform seemed somehow smaller, as if witnessing something beyond his understanding had diminished his physical presence. "Not to us, sir," Maya replied respectfully, to conventional thinking. Bradford's jaw tightened. He moved behind his desk with deliberate slowness, opening a locked drawer and extracting a classified document. His eyes never left hers as he slid it across the polished surface. It contained topographical maps, distance calculations, and a photograph of a target positioned in what appeared to desert terrain. "You see this?" he asked quietly. "This is a real scenario, hostile position, target at 3,800 meters. Your responsibility, one shot. Success means unlimited funding, full military support, integration of your methods across all training protocols. Failure means desk duty for the remainder of your career, shuffling paperwork, attending meetings, watching younger soldiers advance past you while you fade into irrelevance." The room seemed to contract around them. Officers in adjacent offices had gone silent, sensing something momentous occurring behind the general's closed door. "The distance is suicide for conventional weapons," Bradford continued, standing now, his figure commanding despite his earlier diminishment. "No scope, no advanced ballistic computer, just you and that ancient rifle you cherish so much, just your understanding against the laws of physics themselves." Maya processed the information with her characteristic stillness. Most soldiers would have protested, negotiated, requested impossible accommodations. Instead, she visualized the trajectory, calculated wind resistance patterns, began the mental mathematics that would dominate the next 2 months. "When?" she asked simply. 60 days, Bradford replied. "You'll have the range exclusively, whatever resources you need. But soldier," he paused meaningfully, his eyes hardening, "understand that you're not just gambling with your career, you're gambling with my credibility. I've endorsed you publicly. If you fail, I look foolish. And I don't accept foolishness from my personnel." Maya extended her hand across the desk. Bradford hesitated, then gripped it firmly. Their hands locked, iron against iron, in a gesture that transcended military protocol. In that moment, both understood they'd stepped beyond conventional reality into territory where only the extraordinary survived. "I won't disappoint you, sir," Maya said quietly. As she turned to leave, Bradford called out, "Sergeant, I'm counting on something remarkable." Maya paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. "You'll get exactly that, sir." She departed, leaving Bradford alone with his thoughts and the terrible certainty that he'd just unleashed something dangerous, or magnificent. Possibly both. Sleep became Maya's enemy. She transformed an abandoned warehouse on the base's perimeter, a structure originally built for ammunition storage during the Cold War, into a fortress of calculations and obsession. The cavernous space echoed with her footsteps as she paced endlessly, muttering equations to herself like incantations. Every wall became covered with ballistic charts, wind pattern analyses, humidity calculations, and handwritten equations that sprawled across surfaces in increasingly frantic penmanship. The first week consumed 47 hours of continuous work. She didn't return to her quarters, instead collapsing onto a cot she'd positioned in the warehouse's corner whenever her body simply refused to continue functioning. She'd wake in darkness, disoriented and gasping, immediately returning to her calculations as if no time had passed. Empty coffee cups accumulated like archaeological layers, documenting her descent into single-minded focus. On her makeshift desk, a folding table salvaged from a supply closet, lay the M1 Garand disassembled into component parts. She'd taken it apart completely, studying every mechanism, every tolerance, understanding how each piece contributed to the whole. She measured barrel thickness, analyzed firing pin tension, calculated spring compression ratios. Every component possessed meaning that extended beyond conventional specifications. Her fingers bled from constantly manipulating metal components, adjusting mechanisms that most gunsmiths would have considered perfectly acceptable. But Maya sought perfection beyond acceptable. She pursued perfection that existed only in the intersection between physics and impossible demand. Calluses hardened across her palms, then split open, then hardened again in cycles of injury and adaptation. The firing range became her meditation chamber. She fired thousands of practice rounds, each one costing money from her own modest salary, each one teaching her something new about physics and human limitation. Her shoulder bruised from recoil, absorbed across countless shots. Her ears rang constantly from percussion, despite hearing protection. Her eyes developed a peculiar sensitivity to light from extended concentration. But each shot educated her. The M1 Garand revealed its secrets gradually, the way it handled crosswinds, how temperature affected bullet trajectory, precisely how humidity influenced air density. She documented every variable, building comprehensive databases of performance across different conditions. A lesser person would have abandoned such obsessive accumulation of data as irrelevant minutiae. Maya understood it as the language the rifle spoke. Private James Torres discovered her one morning at 3 a.m., standing alone in absolute darkness, firing at targets she could barely perceive. The warehouse became an otherworldly landscape, muzzle flashes illuminating faces of ghosts, echoes bouncing off concrete walls like spirits returning from past conflicts. "Sergeant, you'll destroy yourself," Torres whispered, emerging from the shadows like concern personified. He'd become her most dedicated recruit, the one who'd grasped her philosophy most completely during those 3 weeks of intensive training. He possessed an intuition about ballistics that suggested he'd been born understanding these principles. Maya lowered the rifle, her face haggard from sleep deprivation, her eyes burning with fierce determination that bordered on religious fervor. Sweat darkened her training uniform despite the warehouse's cold temperature. "Every legendary marksman who ever lived," she rasped, her voice rough from disuse and exhaustion, understood one fundamental truth: the weapon doesn't matter, the technology doesn't matter, only the mind controlling the weapon matters. She held the M1 Garand to her chest like a sacred relic, almost like a mother protecting an infant. The greatest killers in history didn't have computers or thermal imaging or advanced optics. They had understanding. They had discipline. They had the capacity to become one with their weapon. Torres watched her with a mixture of concern and awe. He was witnessing something supernatural, a warrior transcending human limitations through pure will and obsessive focus. Most soldiers worked within their physical constraints. Maya appeared to be dismantling her constraints through mental discipline. "How do you stay calm?" he asked softly, his voice nearly inaudible. "With 60 days shrinking toward nothing, with the general watching, with your career depending on something that seems impossible." Maya turned to face him directly, her silhouette illuminated by moonlight streaming through the warehouse's high windows. Sweat glistened across her face and neck. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her expression radiated something beyond exhaustion, a clarity that transcended physical limitation. "Fear and doubt," she whispered, "are luxuries I can't afford anymore." She gestured slowly toward the distant target range visible through the warehouse opening. "In 48 days, everyone watching, the general, the officers, the cameras, the analysts, everyone will either witness history or watch me destroyed completely. There's no middle ground. There's no acceptable failure here." She smiled coldly, and Torres understood he was seeing something few humans ever glimpsed: absolute commitment stripped of pretense. "So I choose history," Maya said quietly. "I choose to become something greater than my current limitations. The alternative is unacceptable." Torres nodded, understanding profoundly that he was in the presence of obsession transforming into mastery. He retreated silently, leaving her alone with the rifle and the mathematics that consumed her consciousness completely. 24 hours remained. The countdown had compressed into a single day that contained eternity. Maya hadn't slept in 36 hours, operating on a combination of black coffee, adrenaline, and something deeper, a psychological state that transcended normal human consciousness. She moved through the warehouse like a ghost, her body operating on muscle memory, while her mind occupied dimensions beyond physical reality. She decided that the final night required sanctuary, the shooting range where it all mattered, where calculation met execution, where theory transformed into devastating reality. The range lay empty at midnight, moonlight transforming the landscape into something otherworldly and surreal. Distant hills created natural barriers that muffled sound, creating an almost sacred silence broken only by her breathing and rifle discharge. Maya settled prone on the hillside that would serve as her shooting position tomorrow, the M1 pressed against her shoulder with the intimacy of a lover's embrace. The rifle had become an extension of her body through weeks of obsessive practice. Her muscles remembered every adjustment, every micro-movement required for precise aim. Her fingers knew exactly where to position themselves on the stock without conscious thought. She fired methodically through the darkness, not rapidly but with deliberate spacing. Each shot a meditation, each trigger pull a prayer. The ancient weapon roared repeatedly into the night, sound waves propagating across the empty landscape like spirits being released. She wasn't firing at specific targets tonight, but rather communing with the rifle itself, conducting a final conversation between weapon and warrior. Each discharge taught her something new. The M1's recoil pattern varied infinitesimally depending on atmospheric conditions. Wind currents shifted with subtle unpredictability, requiring constant micro-adjustments to sight picture. The rifle's barrel temperature fluctuated from repeated firing, affecting how bullets traveled through the bore. Every variable presented challenges that demanded continuous adaptation. By 4 a.m., Maya had fired 217 rounds. Her shoulder throbbed with deep ache that transcended conventional pain, pain that had evolved into a kind of message, a physical reminder that her body possessed limits even if her will refused to acknowledge them. Her ears rang constantly despite hearing protection, creating a high-pitched frequency that had become her constant companion for weeks. But something fundamental had shifted. She'd stopped thinking about the shot and started becoming the shot. Her consciousness expanded beyond individual components, rifle, bullet, trajectory, wind, and entered a unified space where all elements merged into singular purpose. She understood now why ancient warriors spoke of transcendence during combat. This was that state, consciousness stripped of doubt, expanded into pure action. Private Torres appeared from the darkness at 5 a.m., carrying 2 thermoses of coffee and an expression of profound concern. He'd begun sleeping near the warehouse entrance, understanding somehow that Maya would need presence, companionship that required no words or explanations. They'd formed a bond that transcended military hierarchy, the connection between a master and a student who truly grasped the master's vision. "Sergeant," Torres said softly, settling beside her on the hillside, "you need rest. Tomorrow requires everything you possess." Maya lowered the rifle, her hands trembling slightly from fatigue and emotional intensity. She accepted the coffee gratefully, the warmth spreading through her frozen fingers. For several minutes, they sat in absolute silence, 2 soldiers contemplating the impossible mountain they'd constructed together. "In 48 hours," Maya finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, "I'll either become legendary or irrelevant." She turned to face Torres, her dark eyes reflecting moonlight like mirrors revealing truth. "There's no middle ground for this shot. Success means everything changes. My career, military training doctrine, how nations think about warfare. Failure means I disappear into desk duty obscurity, becoming a cautionary tale about hubris." Torres listened without interrupting, understanding that she needed to voice these thoughts, to externalize the weight crushing her consciousness. "The physical part of this shot, that's solved," Maya continued, her voice steadying into professional cadence. "I understand the rifle completely now. I've calculated every variable within human capacity to calculate. Ballistics, wind patterns, humidity, temperature gradients, I've documented it all." She paused, her expression shifting towards something more vulnerable. "But the mental part, that's the real challenge. Tomorrow, I need to eliminate doubt completely. Doubt is the only thing that can defeat me now." Torres nodded slowly. You won't fail, Sergeant. I've watched you transform these past weeks. You're not the same person who walked into General Bradford's office. You've become something extraordinary. Maya smiled faintly, the expression containing both gratitude and something sadder, the recognition of sacrifices made, of normal human existence abandoned for this singular moment. She looked down at the M1 Garand in her hands, its metal surface catching moonlight. Tomorrow, she whispered almost to the rifle itself, we change everything. They sat together in silence as darkness gradually surrendered to approaching dawn, two soldiers contemplating destiny waiting just beyond the horizon. Dawn broke over the range in crimson and gold, nature's own symphony performing for an audience utterly unaware of its significance. The shooting range erupted with controlled chaos as hundreds of military observers arrived in organized formation. Armored vehicles transported equipment and personnel. News crews positioned themselves behind reinforced barriers, their cameras prepared to document whatever miracle or catastrophe was about to unfold. International military attachés stood with folded arms, their skepticism radiating like heat waves off desert sand. General Marcus Bradford arrived precisely at sunrise, his dress uniform impeccable despite the early hour. He stood rigid at the observation post, binoculars in hand, scanning the distant target, a tiny dark speck positioned 3,800 meters away, almost 2.5 miles across terrain that rose and fell unpredictably. The target appeared impossibly small from this distance, a mere suggestion of something rather than an actual object. Officers clustered around him, their conversations hushed and tinged with anticipation. Bradford's confidence had crumbled during the weeks preceding this moment. He'd researched extensively, consulting ballistics experts, studying physics, reviewing military records of extreme distance shots. The consensus was unanimous. 3,800 meters exceeded the M1 Garand's effective range by nearly 2,000 meters. The bullet would lose velocity, trajectory would become unpredictable, air density would affect projectile path in ways nearly impossible to calculate precisely. Bradford had essentially ordered an impossible task. Yet something in Maya's absolute certainty had prevented him from canceling the demonstration. Perhaps he understood intuitively that witnessing the impossible might be worth the professional risk. Perhaps he'd recognized genuine mastery and wanted confirmation it actually existed beyond theory. Maya lay prone on the designated hillside at 6 a.m., utterly motionless, the M1 Garand nestled against her like a partner in a decades-long marriage. She'd positioned herself at the precise location she'd selected weeks ago, a location offering optimal sight lines, natural wind barriers, and psychological centeredness. Her body occupied the shooting position, but her consciousness existed elsewhere, in the realm between earth and sky, between bullet and target, between possibility and impossible achievement. She wore no special equipment, no advanced optics, no ballistic computer, just her eyes, her understanding, and the ancient rifle that had become an extension of her will. She'd removed her watch deliberately, time was irrelevant. She'd left her phone in quarters, distractions were irrelevant. Only the intersection between moment and purpose mattered. Her breathing had achieved a rhythm that transcended normal respiration, slow, deep, meditative breathing that oxygenated her blood completely while maintaining absolute calm. She'd practiced this breathing pattern for weeks, understanding that panic killed precision more effectively than any physical limitation. Her heart rate had slowed to 50 beats per minute, a state achievable only through extreme mental discipline. Wind gusts attacked unpredictably from multiple directions. Heat waves distorted her vision of the distant target, creating mirages that shifted and reformed continuously. She'd calculated mathematical models for various wind speeds, but nature rarely followed predictions precisely. The variables were infinite and constantly changing. Most shooters would have abandoned the attempt, understanding that conditions were suboptimal and success improbable. Maya had abandoned the concept of optimality weeks ago. She existed now in pure adaptation, reading wind shifts, adjusting for heat distortion, continuously calculating corrections that would compress 3,800 meters into a compressed reality, where her understanding compressed distance into irrelevance. Minutes stretched into eternity. Officers in the observation post grew restless. Bradford checked his watch repeatedly, his skepticism metastasizing into certainty that this was theater, an elaborate performance that would conclude with humiliating failure. One general whispered to another, "She's wasting everyone's time. This is impossible." Then Maya's body tensed infinitesimally, a micro-movement visible only to those trained to recognize the precise moment between thought and action. Her trigger finger tightened with the gentleness of someone caressing something precious. Her breathing completed one final cycle. Her consciousness compressed into singular focus. She fired. The M1 Garand roared like a dragon awakening from centuries of slumber. The sound exploded across the range with devastating authority, not a sharp crack, but a deep, resonant boom that originated from the weapon's very soul. The report echoed off distant mountains, bouncing back across the landscape in waves of returning sound. Observers felt the percussion in their chests, experiencing the visceral reality of ancient power unleashed. For 3 eternal seconds, silence consumed everything. Then, 3 miles away, beyond the reach of normal sight, at a distance most humans couldn't comprehend, the target erupted in a catastrophic explosion of fire and obliteration. The distant hillside bloomed with flame and smoke, the blast wave visible even from the observation post as a visible distortion of air and atmosphere itself. Officers gasped simultaneously, their voices merging into a chorus of astonishment and disbelief. General Bradford lowered his binoculars slowly, his face draining of color as reality rewrote itself before his consciousness. The impossible had become inevitable. Silence fell like a tomb, the kind of absolute quiet that only follows moments of transcendent significance. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe as the enormity of what they'd witnessed settled across the observation post like morning fog over water. The explosion's afterimage burned in everyone's vision, a ghost impression of fire and destruction that had materialized at impossible distance, defying conventional understanding of ballistic physics. General Marcus Bradford stood absolutely motionless, his binoculars still raised even though the target had ceased to exist. His mind struggled to process what his eyes had confirmed. The distant hillside still smoldered faintly, visible heat distortion rising from the impact site. Smoke drifted lazily across the landscape, dissipating into the atmosphere like the physical manifestation of an impossible dream becoming undeniable reality. Then, as if a spell had shattered, the observation post erupted. Officers screamed simultaneously, their voices merging into unintelligible chaos. Soldiers jumped, shouting congratulations to no one in particular. Photographers sprinted toward better vantage points, their cameras capturing images of shocked faces and upraised hands. International military attachés stood rigid, their skepticism transformed into something approaching religious awe. "Did she?" one general began, unable to complete the sentence. "At 3,800 meters, another confirmed, his voice trembling slightly. "She hit a target at 3,800 meters with a World War II rifle. No scope, no computer, just understanding." Bradford finally lowered his binoculars, his hands trembling noticeably. His entire body seemed to vibrate with barely contained shock. He'd gambled his professional credibility on this moment, and that gamble had transcended ordinary success into something approaching legend. He looked toward the hillside where Maya remained prone, though from this distance she appeared as merely a dark speck against tan earth. Maya remained absolutely motionless for several additional seconds, her consciousness gradually returning from the transcendent space where the shot had lived. Her body trembled violently, not from cold or weakness, but from the adrenaline discharge flooding her system with chemical intensity. Her hands shook so severely she could barely set the M1 Garand aside. Her breathing had accelerated into rapid gasps, her body's physical response to extreme mental exertion demanding oxygen replenishment. She sat up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, understanding that sudden movement might shatter her equilibrium. For a moment, she simply stared toward the distant explosion site, processing what her body had accomplished through her mind's direction. The shot existed now, not as possibility or theory or desperate hope, but as historical fact. The impossible had transformed into inevitable. Private James Torres sprinted up the hillside with abandon, tears streaming openly down his face, his voice raw with excitement and emotion. "Sergeant, Sergeant, you did it! You actually did it!" He screamed her name repeatedly, the words tumbling out in incomplete sentences and fragmented shouts. He reached her position gasping, his entire body vibrating with transmitted adrenaline. Maya looked up at him, and for the first time in weeks, her expression softened completely. A smile, genuine and unguarded, crossed her face. She stood slowly, accepting Tor's embrace as he practically lifted her off the ground in celebration. Other soldiers began arriving from the observation post, rushing toward her position in waves of congratulation and astonishment. General Bradford approached slowly and deliberately, his ceremonial formality reasserting itself even as his mind continued processing impossible reality. Officers parted respectfully, creating a pathway for his advancement. When he reached Maya, he simply stopped and stared at her, his mouth moving silently as if searching for words that simply didn't exist. "How did you," Bradford began, then stopped, "what you just accomplished?" "Understanding, sir," Maya interrupted quietly, her voice hoarse from exertion and exhaustion. "Just understanding the fundamentals." Bradford studied her for a long moment, this woman who'd transformed from seeming delusion into undeniable legend. Her uniform was soaked with sweat. Her face was streaked with dust and emotion. Her eyes burned with the intensity of someone who'd touched something transcendent. She looked simultaneously fragile and invulnerable, simultaneously human and superhuman. "That shot," Bradford finally said, his voice carrying unprecedented respect, "was the most remarkable thing I've ever witnessed." He extended his hand slowly, the gesture carrying weight beyond simple military courtesy. When their hands clasped, it wasn't commander greeting subordinate. It was human acknowledging human who'd accomplished something extraordinary. Around them, soldiers continued celebrating, photographers continued documenting, international observers continued processing what they'd witnessed. But in that moment between Maya and Bradford, something deeper occurred, recognition that the world had shifted fundamentally. The old certainties about technology and modernity had been shattered by an ancient rifle and a woman's absolute dedication to understanding. The shockwave from that single shot would ripple outward for decades, transforming military training doctrine worldwide and challenging every assumption about how warfare should be approached. But in this moment, Maya simply stood quietly, accepting congratulations while her body trembled with the aftereffects of achieving the impossible. The shot heard around the world transformed overnight into something approaching mythology. Military analysts everywhere questioned everything they'd believed about modern warfare. Defense contractors who'd invested billions in advanced optical systems and ballistic computers found themselves suddenly defensive. Military academies worldwide convened emergency conferences to discuss what had transpired on that distant range. News networks broadcast Maya's face repeatedly, a warrior who'd achieved the impossible armed only with understanding and an ancient rifle. International military delegations began requesting her expertise before the week concluded. South Korea sent its most elite marksmen. Russia expressed diplomatic interest in consulting her methodologies. NATO nations submitted formal requests for training protocols. Every military force on Earth suddenly understood that they'd been approaching marksmanship incorrectly. that technology without foundational mastery was merely expensive equipment wielded by partially trained soldiers. General Bradford kept his word without hesitation. He submitted her achievements through official channels, recommending promotion and unlimited program funding. The Pentagon accepted his recommendations immediately, understanding instinctively that what Maya represented transcended ordinary military advancement. She demonstrated a fundamental truth about human potential that challenged comfortable assumptions about technological superiority. Within 2 weeks, Maya received official notification of promotion to lieutenant colonel. The new rank carried authority, resources, and opportunity. She could have accepted a prestigious desk position overseeing military training doctrine worldwide. Officers who'd spent decades climbing hierarchies would have killed for such advancement, but Maya declined the offer with characteristic directness. "I teach people to think," she stated during the promotion ceremony, her voice steady and clear. "I don't accomplish that from behind administrative desks. I accomplish that by working directly with soldiers, by showing them through example that mastery transcends technology, that understanding matters infinitely more than equipment." Bradford, standing beside her in dress uniform, smiled with genuine respect. He'd expected her refusal, understanding now that Maya operated according to principles that transcended ambition. She pursued mastery itself, not the external rewards that mastery generated. Her newly funded program expanded explosively. She maintained her staff sergeant rank deliberately, choosing to remain accessible to recruits, refusing the artificial distance that command hierarchy created. But her program now operated with virtually unlimited resources. She established training facilities across multiple military installations. Soldiers began rotating through her curriculum as a prerequisite for advanced marksmanship positions. Her methodology spread like intellectual wildfire through military establishments worldwide. She developed comprehensive training manuals that emphasized mathematical understanding before weapon discharge. She created certification programs that required soldiers to pass rigorous analytical examinations before they could advance to practical shooting. She taught meditation techniques that transformed soldiers' capacity for focus and calm under pressure. The ancient M1 Garand became legendary. Museums requested it for display. Hollywood producers inquired about dramatizing the story, but Maya refused all such offers, keeping the rifle in her office as a teaching tool and reminder. Every new student who entered that office encountered the weapon that had changed everything, held it carefully, understood they were touching historical significance. International military delegations arrived regularly, uniformed officers from dozens of nations requesting to observe her methodology. She welcomed them all, teaching principles rather than secrets, understanding that military strength ultimately served humanity better when all forces operated according to similar ethical standards. A soldier trained in discipline and understanding presented less danger to civilians than a soldier trained only to follow orders mechanically. The ripple effects extended beyond military structures. Universities began examining her mathematical approaches to ballistics and physics. Sports shooting organizations requested her training methods. Olympic committees inquired whether her techniques could improve marksmanship competition results. But Maya remained focused on military applications, understanding that her fundamental mission involved creating better soldiers, not celebrity athletes. 6 months after the impossible shot, military academies worldwide had integrated her philosophy into official curriculum. The Naval Academy, West Point, the Air Force Academy, all restructured their marksmanship training around principles of understanding and discipline rather than technical equipment mastery. Accuracy rates improved across all branches, consistently, measurably, dramatically. General Bradford visited her office regularly, watching her teach younger soldiers with the same intensity she'd once brought to her own training. He'd aged somehow in those 6 months, but his expression carried peace. The peace of a commander who understood he'd recognized genuine mastery, and had possessed the wisdom to support it despite initial skepticism. "You could have taken anything," he said during one visit, observing her teach a class of attentive recruits. "Promotion, prestige, corporate consulting contracts." Maya smiled slightly, never breaking focus on her students. "I took what mattered, sir. I took the opportunity to transform how people understand mastery. That's worth more than any rank or contract." The M1 Garand hung above her desk like a sacred artifact, its wooden stock worn smooth from handling, its metal surface reflecting light that seemed somehow different from ordinary illumination. The light of historical significance, of impossible achievement, of fundamental transformation. The revolution had begun with a single shot and an ancient rifle. But its impact would reshape military thinking for generations. 6 months dissolved into a year, then 2 years, then a decade. Time moved differently now, measured not in calendar increments but in the transformation of military culture worldwide. Staff Sergeant James Torres stood before hundreds of new recruits in the same warehouse where Maya had forged her legendary shot, demonstrating her principles with the religious devotion of someone who'd witnessed transcendence firsthand. His uniform bore the insignia of Master Sergeant, a rank earned through demonstrated mastery of Maya's methodology rather than bureaucratic advancement. "A weapon is merely equipment," Torres instructed, his voice resonating with authority earned through years of dedicated practice. "Understanding is power. Discipline is invincible. Your mind is the most dangerous weapon you'll ever possess." The recruits listened with absolute attention, understanding they were receiving education from someone who'd stood beside a legend, who'd learned directly from the woman who'd transformed warfare thinking. The ancient M1 Garand hung in Maya's office, no longer a relic relegated to museum status, but a permanent installation symbolizing what dedication could accomplish. Young soldiers throughout the military now made pilgrimages to that office, touching the weapon carefully, understanding they were connecting with historical significance. Some wept when holding it, experiencing the weight of what it represented, not just metal and wood, but the physical manifestation of human potential transcending technological limitations. Maya herself had evolved beyond individual achievement into something approaching institutional authority. She declined further promotions repeatedly, maintaining her staff sergeant rank as deliberate choice. She understood that remaining accessible to recruits, refusing the artificial distance that command hierarchy created, meant her message penetrated more effectively than rank-based authority could achieve. She taught daily, worked directly with soldiers constantly, mentored the next generation of elite marksmen with the same intensity she'd once brought to her own training. Her office walls displayed photographs documenting the revolution she'd initiated. Military forces from 60 nations had integrated her methodology into official training doctrine. Accuracy rates had improved consistently. 40% improvements across all branches represented merely the conservative estimate. More significantly, soldiers trained under her philosophy demonstrated superior decision-making capabilities, enhanced stress management, improved discipline under extreme pressure. Her impact transcended ballistics into fundamental military psychology. International recognition arrived constantly. The President of the United States presented her with the Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor. She accepted it quietly, understanding the award recognized not individual glory, but the transformation of military training worldwide. Other nations followed: France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, all bestowing their highest honors upon the woman who'd revolutionized how militaries approached marksmanship and discipline. But the awards that truly mattered to Maya existed beyond official recognition. They manifested in the soldiers she'd trained, thousands of them now, who carried her principles into their daily lives. She received letters constantly from former students describing how her methodology had saved their lives in combat situations, how her emphasis on understanding had allowed them to make critical decisions under impossible pressure, how her discipline had transformed them into warriors who fought with intelligence rather than mere reaction. General Bradford visited occasionally, now retired from active service but remaining closely connected to military affairs. He'd aged noticeably, his hair completely silver, his movements slightly slower, but his eyes retained the brightness they'd acquired when witnessing Maya's impossible shot. He would sit in her office quietly, watching her teach, understanding profoundly that he'd made the correct decision all those years ago when he'd challenged her to prove the impossible. "You know," he said during one such visit, "I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd dismissed you instead of challenging you, if I'd laughed and walked away." Maya smiled slightly, never breaking attention from the recruit she was instructing. "You would have forgotten the moment within days, sir. I would have found another way. The truth has a way of emerging regardless of individual circumstances." "Perhaps," Bradford conceded, "but I'm grateful I witnessed it directly." 2 years into the second decade following the legendary shot, Maya stood before a packed auditorium at the Pentagon. Military leaders from 50 nations filled the seats: generals, admirals, colonels, representatives from every major military power on Earth. They'd gathered for an unprecedented symposium on advanced marksmanship training, drawn by the undeniable evidence that Maya's methodology represented the future of military excellence. "A weapon is only as powerful as the person holding it," she told them, her voice filling the auditorium with the same quiet authority that had characterized her from the beginning. "Master yourself first. Understand your tools completely. Respect the discipline of your craft. These principles transcend marksmanship. They apply to every aspect of military excellence, to every challenge demanding human performance at extraordinary levels." The applause that erupted transcended ordinary appreciation. It represented acknowledgement of fundamental transformation, recognition that one woman with an ancient rifle had reshaped global military thinking. As the ovation continued, Maya gazed toward the back of the auditorium, where that M1 Garand hung in a place of honor, the weapon that had changed everything. General Bradford stood nearby, tears streaming down his weathered face, understanding completely that he'd witnessed not just military revolution, but the emergence of a philosophy that would influence human development for generations to come. The old rifle that made a general laugh had become the symbol of impossible achievement, proof that understanding, discipline, and dedication could overcome any limitation humanity faced. And the revolution initiated by a single shot continued rippling outward, transforming military culture worldwide and inspiring soldiers everywhere to pursue mastery beyond technological boundaries. The end.